Several times I've been asked to share my story, and in fact, there are 3 publications out there circulating around with my story. First one was a book that I wrote around 2000. It was called Testimony of a Seeker, and basically I wrote the book because the publisher told me the only way they would publish a book that I wrote was if I told my story. They didn't want to hear me do a teaching book or anything like that. They just wanted my story. So because I wanted to get into writing, that was the door that was open for me. I went through it and I wrote out my story, how I came to Jesus, how I came to know his present truth message. And then years later, I ended up writing another version of the same story for guide-age kids, younger kids. And believe it or not, there's a 3rd publication with my story in it. And it's like a graphic novel, i.e. comic book, that's out there with my story in it. I can't figure out why people want to hear my story. It's not that exciting. I was never a Satan worshiper. I was never a drug dealer, even. I wasn't a prostitute. I didn't go through anything really sensational in my life. It was just a human being trying to fill the big empty space inside, and the steps that occurred and continue to occur. And so I don't really feel qualified to have a really exciting testimony, but here I am. Not only one night, but the whole week I'm going to be breaking up my story into pieces. And I have to assume, because I'm here and you're all listening, that there's something in what I've experienced that'll be a benefit to you. To make things worse, and if you don't mind pulling up the first slide, I came from a really perfect family. I mean, some people, don't have really exciting stories, but they had a lot of heartbreak in their childhood. They had abuse or alcoholism or something. But I came into a very classic sort of what we would call an all-American family. I don't know what you call it here. Is it an all-Australian family? What do you, just this classic, conventional, intact, stable family. And parents stayed together. Neither parent was an addict per se. They were good people. They were relatively happy. They had 4 kids that were all pretty healthy. Here we are, you can see that I'm kind of pasting on a smile. I don't look really like I'm into what's happening, but, we were just a really classic, decent family. But, even in those decent situations, there's a hunger that decency can't satisfy. So by the time I kind of came into young adulthood, you can bring up the next slide if you don't mind. I'll show you a few pictures. These are terrible pictures because they're the only ones I have. But by the time I came into young adulthood, I was really confused and needed Jesus in a big way. But the thing was, I was a member of a church. So when you're a member of a church, it's kind of hard to identify what's missing if you're supposedly getting it every week. But it was a very nominal church situation. It was the kind of church you went to, and it was all the classic hymns, a lot of the ones you're singing here, not done in quite exactly the same style, more of a classic organ type of thing, but it was, really nice hymnody and really good sermons and youth program and everything, but there was no real effort in that church context to bring people individually to a knowledge of Jesus, to a personal relationship with Jesus. In fact, there was a youth leader who the only private conversation I remember having with him was me talking, and he had these big blue eyes and blonde hair. His name was Jesse. And I'm talking, babbling on about something in my life, and he's looking at me, and he starts looking really kind of intensely at me, and finally I just reacted, "Why are you looking at me like that?" And he said, "I'm reading your aura," which is kind of out of sort of Eastern thought, and I didn't know a whole lot about that kind of thing, and so I was just like, "Why are you saying you're reading my aura?" But that's what he said to me in that quiet moment that he had with one of the youth that he was supposed to be leading, and there was just no real effort made. Our church had dances, and we had horror movies that we would show and charge a ticket price, and people would come. Several things happened in that church context that really affected me. I remember the choir director, I was always in the choir, loved music, was in the choir, and the choir director left his wife for the lead soprano in the church. Yeah, that kind of soured me a little bit. And then one night I was out with my friends, and go ahead and you can scroll through the next couple of pictures. I was out with my friends, kind of running around. I was a little bit of a wild person by that time, and bumped into the pastor of the church. Now, this man was pretty much worshipped by the congregation. He was a very gifted orator, and he had a big, deep kind of chocolate voice, and he could really speak well, and people just almost worshiped the ground he walked on, and we're very thankful to have him as the pastor. But I saw the man in a gas station with a group of friends, and we're kind of running around having a great time, saw him there, and I walked up to say hi, and he shook my hand, and I realized within a few minutes that he was drunk. And he had my hand in his hand, and he was sort of caressing my hand, and he was looking into my eyes, and he said, and it was funny because he was a very gifted speaker, but he was drunk, so he was like lisping. Sometimes people like regress into their worst habits when they're drunk, and so he was like saying things like, he was trying to tell me, you were always one of my favorites, but he was going, you were always one of my favorites. You were always one of my favorites, So he's like caressing my hand, and I just knew what was going on, and it was so disgusting, And I remember walking away from that, went back in the car with my friends, and I remember thinking, that's it with me and Christianity. If the product of Christianity is that kind of double life, that kind of hypocrisy, I really want nothing to do with it. So as the result of that, I started to search. I wanted to find the truth. That's the one thing that remained intact throughout my whole journey, is I knew there was a truth out there somewhere. And I wanted to figure out what it was. And I assumed that it was in some kind of religious or spiritual context. So I was willing to follow, the song that we just sang. It was so beautiful, and the music has been beautiful. He leadeth me. I believed that there was a benevolent force in the universe that would lead me step by step, and that I would ultimately come into a knowledge of who this benevolent force was, whether it was a he or a she or an it, whatever. I believed that it would lead me. And so I was looking for opportunities. I was looking for cues. And one of the cues came in the form of, I had a back problem. I had a curvature of the spine. And I can show you, I have a place in my spine where 3 of the vertebrae bumps are missing. It's really weird. But my spine also curves, and I've never really had much trouble with it. But when they first discovered it, they thought, this is going to be a problem. She's going to have issues growing, as she grows. And so we need to send her to a back doctor. So I went to a back doctor, which happened to be a friend of my mom's, and the guy told me to do yoga. So I started to practice yoga because it strengthens your back. Through that experience, I ended up in a yoga class, and the teacher of the yoga class was deeply into meditation. And so I got introduced to the whole concept of meditation. And I loved the whole idea of nature and of just that lifestyle of being in a place of peace. And so it really appealed to me. You can go to the next slide if you want. Here's me kind of looking. Oh, no, not that one. Back up. You went through them. That's good. Just stay there. So I ended up getting into yoga, getting into meditation. And I would practice meditation pretty consistently every day. In fact, I was more faithful with meditation than I think I am now with prayer. I would get out of my bed every day, and I had a terrarium. And I would sit in front of the terrarium, and I would do this deep breathing exercise and meditate and just breathe in and meditate and breathe out. I don't even remember what I did, but it was my effort to find that truth, whatever it was. I went through some tragedies as a young person. I'm going to unpack them a little bit later in the week. I was bullied on the playground as a younger teen. I went through a real tragic breakup and very emotionally difficult experience with a guy in high school. So there were some things that really shook me up and made life emotionally difficult for me. But I got through high school, basically did not know who I was or where I was going. My parents were extremely career-oriented. My father had grown up both of my parents had grown up in poverty. They'd been through the Depression. My father described to me how he would eat white bread with milk and sugar on it for supper because they were that poor growing up. And he had vowed to himself that he would not stay in that poverty. And he went to college, and he got through college and got an education and got a really good job and earned money and made himself a successful person, having grown up in poverty. And so for him, the thing that was most important to him as a parent was to help his kids reach that same level of success. But we had grown up with the benefits of his success, and we took it totally for granted, and we were just over it. And so I was not interested at all in pursuing a conventional life path. And my parents really urged me to go to college so I could get the education and the career, and were really pushing me in that direction. And everything within me just pushed back and wanted nothing to do with it. And I know now that it's because I had an emptiness inside of me. There was a spiritual void inside of me that if it wasn't filled, no career, no amount of any security materially was going to make any difference. There was just a basic kind of ongoing existential crisis in my life. And I had to know why I was created and for what purpose I was put on this planet. So I continued my spiritual search, and it took me to a certain school. I did go to college, didn't want to, but I finally found a school that had a type of education that was very loosely structured, and people could study pretty much what they wanted. And so I signed up for that, and I ended up actually going to the school and living in an apartment with some young people and getting exposed for the first time to really extreme culture. I'd grown up in somewhat of a sheltered environment. You know, I'd seen some rough things and been exposed to some things growing up as a teenager, but once I was in college, I got exposed to a lot of things, a lot more things than I had growing up. There was a very strong militant lesbian community on that college campus. There was a lot of sexual deviancy on the campus. There were school retreats I went to that had orgies that I was invited to and declined. But it was kind of a wild environment. Got exposed to a lot of things, but that hunger inside of me continued. Now I discovered dance. There was a really strong dance program in this school. And I wrote a letter to my mom, and I still have the letter, telling her that I had discovered my calling. Like, this was what I was made to do. You know, I've kind of have the physique of a dancer, and was fairly athletic, had grown up, you know, very active, have a good sense of timing and movement and that kind of thing. Actually, I have terrible depth perception. I'm always bumping into things, but for some reason, when I'm dancing, I don't. So go figure, I don't know. But I was real involved in the dance program. And I really enjoyed that, really felt like I'd found myself. But there was still this hunger. I remember going week after week to these classes and just experiencing life and really getting exhilarated at times, but then the weekend would roll around. Friday night would roll around, and I would feel so lonely inside. There was just such a huge, vacuous void inside of me that I just couldn't really arrive at the place where I thought, this is it, I'm truly content. So I tried different things. There were different spiritual options on campus. I remember a retreat one weekend, and we did all kinds of things. I got exposed to shamanism. I got exposed to Taoism. I got exposed to, at one point, Kundalini yoga. Went to an ashram and did a lot of this particular strenuous kind of yoga and meditation. And it was very exhilarating and very exciting, but you walked away just with more questions than answers, and got exposed to a lot of different spiritualities. Again, was meditating consistently, was very faithful with that. I started getting exposed to things that had to do with the occult. A friend of mine read my tarot cards. I was into astrology. I was a Pisces. I really had grown up swimming, and so the fact that I was a Pisces, which was a fish, was really exciting, and I really identified with that. And I kind of went down that road for a while, and I remember getting to the place where I thought, you know, I really need to go all the way with this and just drop out of college and go to an ashram. Ashram is like a community where there would be a guru, which is a spiritual leader, and the guru would train people in whatever the discipline was, and they would ultimately come to enlightenment, which is like the nirvana state where you're there. And I looked at this someone had given me a catalog of all the ashrams that were at that time in the United States. And I remember flipping through this catalog, and one page had the guru, and he was like very twisted up like a pretzel. And the next page had the guru with his eyes rolled back into his head, and he's in some weird pose. And the next thing had the guru with his beard all the way down to his knees. And I closed the catalog, and I said, I'm weird, but I'm not this weird, So I just didn't want to do that, but I was still really hungering and searching. And I'll tell you, one of the things that was the most difficult for me was what we call anthropomorphic theocentricity. Okay, that's a big word. But basically, it's anthropo, which is man, centric, centered, theo is God, man-like God-centeredness. Okay, so the idea is this, that we don't look at human beings to see what God is like necessarily in character, because our characters are different than God's character. He is love. We're not always love, right? But our Creator has to be something like us. So we can't, we are like God to some extent. And what I reasoned at that point in my life is, if God is just some kind of essence, which is what I was being told about God, is that, when you worship these Eastern gods, he's just an impersonal essence. And if God was just some kind of essence, then how did I get my personhood? How did I get these emotions where I can feel loneliness and emptiness and connection and attachment and disappointment in relationships? And where did I get all that if God himself doesn't have those qualities? So every Friday that would roll around, I would feel so empty. And I would just say, if all God is an energy or an essence, then why do I feel lonely inside? I started to wonder if maybe God had some of those emotions himself, or at least addressed them in me. I had subletted an apartment from some friends, people that I knew, and they had gone off, and they had actually experienced a conversion. I didn't know that. We were having a party one night at the house, all kinds of people, lots of food, lots of probably drugs, different things going on, all kinds of partying. And the people that had subletted the house to us walked back in. And it was almost like they had a force field around them, because nobody would get near these people. They walked in, and everybody was like kind of avoiding them. And as I looked a little closer, I saw why. Because they had buttons that said things like, Jesus saves, God is love, and that type of thing. So everybody in the house knew, these people are Jesus freaks. And I wanted to avoid them just as much as anyone else did, because that's the last thing on earth I wanted to be, was a Jesus freak, But there was a voice that spoke to me in that moment, and the voice said, you have tried everything else. You've been open and willing to entertain just about every concept or every religion, every spirituality that you've been exposed to. And to be fair, you have to give them a fair hearing. So I went up to them. They were sitting at a table by themselves. I had given them food. I didn't want to be totally rude, so I had given them some food, and they sat down, and they were eating. And I came up and sat with them, and I said, okay, you can tell me about Jesus, because I knew that's why they were there. And the first thing out of the girls, there were two guys and a girl, the first thing out of the girl's mouth was, it's like the water of life. It just satisfies your thirst. And you just want more and more water of life. And like I told you, I was a Pisces in the astrological symbols, and I loved water. I always have. Loved swimming. She was speaking my language. God knew where I was at. And so he spoke to me in a language I understood. And I just thought, that sounds so good right now. That water of life. I want to know more about that water of life. Those folks ended up leaving, and I was left with this struggle, really an intense struggle, because I'd been exposed now to a witness, but there was a battle, and the forces of darkness did not want to let go of me. But I decided that I would at least experiment, and I'll be honest with you, when I first started on my Christian walk, it was experimental. I didn't know for sure, and I did it for the reason that the Spirit had given me, is I tried everything else. I might as well try this. So I ended up starting to attend different churches. I didn't have a car. I remember looking out my window at the highway from this little farmhouse. At my college was in a little Michigan town, and it was just this college in the middle of nowhere. But there was a highway kind of near the house. And I was looking out my window, and I said, God, if you want me to go to church this morning, have a car go by. And a car went by. And I went out to the highway, and I stuck out my thumb, and I hitchhiked. And I went to one church, and the people wouldn't even look at me. You know, you walk in, and people, like, look away. You know, no warmth, no friendliness whatsoever. Finally ended up at another church that was actually within walking distance, so I didn't have to hitchhike. And it was a Pentecostal church. And they were very warm. They were very excited. You walk in, they're, hugging you. You don't even know them, total strangers. And they were all speaking in tongues. And I remember going up to the front and babbling, because that's what they were doing. It seemed like that's what they were doing. And I did that very well. And they were all hugging me and weeping, oh, welcome to the flock, sister, kind of thing, But then I saw the same person a little bit later in that week at a grocery store or something, and they were as cold as ice. So they couldn't sustain that high, and I started to think, well, maybe that's not the answer. But I was looking and I was searching. Some people came to my house one night. The same friends came back and started to visit with me. And they told me that Jesus is the answer. This is what you've been looking for. And I was hesitant, very, very hesitant, because I really honestly knew that I'd lose all my friends, and I didn't want to become a Jesus freak if it was just another trip, And I remember they left me one night, and I was going home after that. And I went home and spent about a week with my family. And I remember praying and asking God to reveal himself to me, but it felt so flat. It just felt so completely like there was absolutely no resonance whatsoever. But I came back, for some reason, even more determined to kind of road test this Christianity thing. And I went to another church service, and I was sitting in the church service, and I remember telling myself, I will power through. I will go to the front when they make the altar call, because a lot of churches did that. And I'm going to go to the front, and I'm going to make the altar call, and I'm going to raise my hand when they say, give your heart to Jesus. I've got to at least try this, and I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. But I was still scared, and I didn't want to really, I really didn't want to do it, but I did at the same time. And I was going to go up on the last verse. I said, okay, I'll go up on the last verse of the song. Well, they didn't sing the last verse of the song. It's a lesson to you if you're doing an altar call. Sing all of the verses, So I never went up. It's true. But I remember that put this conviction inside of me that I had to somehow follow through on this thing. And I went up to my little room, and I still had my terrarium where I meditated every day, and I began to pray, Jesus, take me back to the Father. That's all I could think of to say. I said it over and over and over. And God is my witness. There was a peace that passes understanding that came on me in that moment. And for the first time in my life, I considered myself a Christian. But then it devolved upon me to try to introduce that concept to my friends there at the college. And unfortunately, all of my roommates just turned on me. It was really, really difficult. It's difficult to lose all your friends, especially when you're a young person, don't have a lot of experience in relationships. I remember one friend, when I told him that Jesus was the answer, that this was it, this is what I've been searching for, he cursed me out and hung up the phone. I remember other people just not wanting to ever see me again. I remember sitting in the backyard of my little farmhouse that I lived in, and there was a guy that I had been friends with. His name was Alan, and I was singing Angels Watching Over Me, sitting in the backyard, swaying back and forth, saying Angels Watching Over Me. And Alan said, Jennifer, you've been through so many trips. You just tried everything. You just had so many ideas. And this is just another one of your trips. Jennifer, this Christianity thing, it's not real. It's not real. Just give up right now. And here I am. Let me think. 45 years later. Yeah. It was not long after that okay, I'll tell you just a little bit of the end of the story here. I was already a vegetarian. The reason I was a vegetarian was because I had been introduced to the concept of reincarnation. And my grandmother died, and I was very close to my grandmother. And I didn't want to eat my grandmother, basically. If she came back as a cow, she could end up as ground beef in my grocery store and fry her up. I just said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to eat anything that was someone at some point. So I became a vegetarian for that motivation. Not exactly the typical motivation that we encourage people with when we're doing health classes and stuff, You shouldn't eat this because it might be your grandmother. I don't think we've ever done that in an Adventist health presentation. But that was the motive that God used with me. And I was already a vegetarian by the time I had, come to Christ. And so I remember feeling like I had to give up eating meat. I'm sorry, I had to give up not eating meat because all the Christians I knew were meat eaters. And so I remember going home and eating a tuna fish casserole and just being like, this is so gross, I really don't want it. And it's so funny to me, when I hear people like, oh, I have to give up meat, God has convicted me. And it was the exact opposite for me. I was like, oh no, I have to give up vegetarianism. But I went to my college one day where I was attending, and they had an Earth Day. So they had all these different booths and all these different people coming in. And there was a group of people that looked really odd and singular. And I remember walking up to the booth, and these people were the women were dressed like it looked like almost pajamas type of thing, really long dresses, and they had long hair. It was kind of pulled back. And there was a guy standing at the booth that was super animated, almost manic animated. And he was saying, this is like a secular college campus. And he's almost shouting out into the crowd saying, I want to see Jesus in you, and you, and you. And he pointed right at me. And I was like, yeah, I'm into that. But they had samples on a little plate, dessert samples and little burger type things that they had made. And so I was a college student. I wiped out both plates and ate all the samples. And then I went back a few minutes later, and the guy's still I want to see Jesus in you, and you. And I wiped out the plate of samples again. And then I went back a few minutes later, and there were little signs, one only, please. So that was it. I was busted. But I went up to the literature rack. They had the old literature rack thing, and I pulled a piece of literature off the rack. And it was the 8 Laws of Health. And it talked about living in harmony with nature, eating plant foods, and exercise, and water, and being outside, and sunlight, and Jesus. And as soon as I saw those two things together, I knew I was home. And so that's where I'm going to leave you for tonight. There's more to come. That's my story.